Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Proper Variant and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 43. This one is about the American Civil War, and it is an important and interesting topic because this is a civil war that is driven by the revolutionary system that we have talked about in the past, not the secessionist system, but it is a secession. How they do that, why they do it, I think that is very important to talk about because I have some wishes when it comes to this, at least the way it is depicted here. I do also want to say that just a few hours ago, I think 2 hours when I'm recording this, 3 hours when you're going to be seeing it, there was an announcement. It is PDX Con 2022. I will be going. It is much smaller than the last PDX Con, and they don't have an official announcement show. What are the implications for Victoria 3? The answer is, I don't know. There will be playable Victoria 3 at that event that will be going on. I think there will be a mega game of 100 plus players in Victoria 3, at least from what I heard, which is pretty insane. But the question is, does this mean that right after, soon after, the game might release? Honestly, I don't know. I was expecting that if there was a release date announcement made at PDX Con, it would be done during an announcement show, but since there is no genuine full-on announcement show, maybe we are actually looking at 2023. Honestly, I wouldn't know, just wanted to bring it up because it is a tidbit, of course, that might get, you know, some thought in there. Now, in this dev diary, we're going to be reading a lot. That is why I didn't really mark that much, only the starting points and the end points of what I want to read, because there is just a lot of information in here. This one was written by Ophelof. This week we're going to talk about the American Civil War, a dark period in the history of the United States. Turmoil had been building under the surface of the United States for decades prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, with tension growing increasingly violent, particularly in the 1850s. In 1861, several states voted to secede from the Union and established the Confederate States of America. The Union and the Confederacy fought for 4 years to 1865. After the surrender of the CSA, the Union reincorporated the states of the former Confederacy and initiated an era generally known as Reconstruction, a period of ambition, domestic unrest, and ultimately a failure to complete some of the most significant social reforms instigated in the wake of the CSA's defeat. The efforts and failures of Reconstruction resulted in Jim Crow laws and the promise of racial equality becoming a generations-long struggle that has carried on well past the end of the Victorian era. Let's get something established first before we dive into the game. Slavery is central to the Civil War. The authors of Secession did not dance around this point. The institution of slavery was singled out time and time again by the people seceding from the Union in their reasons for secession, during their debates over secession, and then throughout the Civil War itself. After the war, rhetoric shifted as the lost cause myth developed, but before and during the war, slavery was declared as a central element in the rebellion time and time again. This interpretation of history is built on solid foundations with ample evidence. Victoria 3 uses this approach as its basis for the American Civil War. This is a really interesting couple of paragraphs here, and I'm very interested in these couple of paragraphs because they acknowledge that for the Civil War there was a lot of run-up, there was a lot going on before that, and in all fairness, Victoria 2 tried to emulate this as well. You would get random events, things would occur. Victoria 3, it is very clear to me, will be working in a similar fashion to Victoria 2, where you get events that agitate people, ultimately sparking the revolt, but it will be much more embedded since it is, of course, a part of the classic revolutionary system. This also makes sense. If you think about it, if you think about the history of the CSA and their rebellion in the name of, you know, keeping slavery alive, this is a question of basically an issue that is either restore or abandon, you know, forbid this principle. And if you remember, those were the movements that could form around laws, making it so that if they radicalize enough, you could have a civil war. Already, I think it is very visible how they connect history here into the game mechanic, where they say, if you get rid of the law, if you try to get rid of the law, then they could say, okay, we want you to preserve it, if you don't do it, we will radicalize, and the other way around as well, of course, as well. This is the very basis of the system, and why this system is fairly well integrated into the question of course, you know, the actual game mechanics. So the history is directly integrated into generalized game mechanics that all nations enjoy in principle, different from Victoria 2, where that didn't happen. The Civil War in America was unique compared to all of the other uprisings and wars that you might experience in Victoria 2. So it is already very nice to see it much more integrated here. Antebellum America's unrest is centered around slavery. The slavery debate tried to resolve the debate between abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates. Slaveholders and abolitionists are engaged in increasingly rancorous debate across the nation. Sooner or later, the arguments will stop being made with words and start being made with bullets. This is the journal system in action. And they basically start with this journal. We're going to see this explained here as well. The United States of America begins the game with a journal entry already underway. In the first years of the game, and historically, the 1830s were already rife with national debate over the issue of slavery, although violence was only just beginning to escalate. At this point, on the national level, all the United States can try to do is balance the pressures of abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates, and either limit escalation or come down firmly on the side of one cape or another. They talked about you potentially being able to avoid the Civil War if you keep people from being too radicalized in either direction. And this is basically what they are reaffirming here. I am a big fan of this. I already mentioned that this system is very clearly integrated, and we're going to see it in screenshots in a second as well. It is very clearly integrated in the vanilla, in the standard formula for revolutions, with a bit of a twist that I wish was applied to all revolutions, but that's a different topic. But the topic here really comes down to the question, okay, we have this system that lets you have a revolution, and if you can avoid within this system to have the revolution, then there will be no civil war. And I think that ultimately, you know, is a potential that you didn't really have, at least not this directly, not this well embedded as it is here in Victoria 3. Even a policy of appeasement and reconciliation will not stop rising tensions entirely. Some events will ratchet up tensions regardless of whatever option is chosen. The main difference in choices is determining who will become more mad and who will be more mollified by ensuing government actions. This is basically railroading in a very soft way. You get these events similar to how you got them in Victoria 2, but you get them basically, especially because the journal is currently active. That's the idea. If you get over the journal, then this stuff will end. I do wonder whether something similar could occur for 1848, 1849, because of course 1848, 1849, you shouldn't railroad it. So the big rebellion in, for example, Germany, in Hungary, in France, in Italy as well, the big rebellions that occurred in that time frame shouldn't be railroaded. If you run a great country, then it shouldn't happen. But the question does remain. 1848, 1849 had a huge knock-on effect, and it had a big impact on, you know, for example, the later years of reunification, not reunification, in Italy and Germany, for example, and the struggle for independence and the dual monarchy later on in Austria-Hungary. I do wonder whether you could have events that are bound to the journal, or whether they are doing this for 1848, 1849 as well, or whether they say this should be entirely freeform, it either develops or it doesn't. I'm very eager to see this, because that is a big question on my mind. If 1848, 1849 doesn't occur, then we're missing a big and very interesting chunk of basically unification and struggle from the bottom towards the top, rather than, for example, how it ended in Germany, the unification and the struggle from the top towards the bottom. The way Germany was unified, of course, was, something basically created by the Prussian authorities, and the way Hungary gained autonomy was created by the Austrian autonomies. So I would be sad if not every game had something like 1848, 1849 going on. Maybe the material circumstances will just do it, but you can see here that they are much more hands-on with, you know, everything going on in the USA, for example, when it comes to this journal entry and the mechanics around the Civil War. You can't just not have it, basically. They introduce you to it, you can solve this problem, but you are confronted with it. And the problems that, you know, and this is a long tangent, but the problems that 1848, 1849 was on are also intrinsic to the circumstances of the populations of Europe at the time. Iowa has become the front line in the fight over slavery and will be struck with unrest regardless of the choice picked. Right, I mean, it does make sense. It's basically, it gives you the option, who do you want to have become radicals, who do you want to have become loyalists, and which side will you strengthen, which sides are you actively siding with. Abolitionists and proponents of slavery have been pouring into Iowa, hoping to shape the territory's government to their liking. Paramilitary groups have begun committing acts of violence against each other and civilians. Before God and in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery. The crimes of this guild can never be purged away, but with blood. Border ruffians cannot dictate law, Iowa must be a free state, or jayhawkers do not decide what is right, Iowa will be a slave state. So this is, if you have played Victoria 2, a very similar situation as to what we had in Victoria 2. I wonder whether this is combined with the question of actually incorporating a state. I'm not actually certain about that. Obviously, they're not talking about it here, but this is, of course, I think a fairly standard approach. This is very similar, in my view at the very least, to how Victoria 2 did it when it comes to this, except, again, it's embedded in the journal system. As tensions rise, violence will rise as well, and events will become more and more polarizing. Early events may talk about a single senator's words or a single death in a city, but as the issue festers, things will just get worse and worse until something gives way. Newspaper debates will turn into arguments on the floor of the Senate, then those arguments will turn into canings, and people will stop campaigning with pamphlets and start campaigning with paramilitaries. I like this a lot. There is a certain degree of escalation here. I wonder how they track it, whether it is just a question of radicalism or whether it is a question of, how the journal itself is doing. We're not really seeing anything here in terms of, the requirements, the conditions and such, so I assume that those are still work in progress, but this is very, very good because the escalation, of course, and the speed of the escalation is something that indeed should play a big role. Once you lose control, there should be some uncertainty in your playstyle because the rebellion might be starting, fairly soon via the rebellion system. Attempts to ban slavery are more likely to create a reactionary movement in the United States, so they tweak the numbers there quite clearly to get this going again within the journal being active. Legacy slavery to slavery banned, it already, leads to debates here, so I assume that it will take some time, that it will be difficult to do, that maybe this also impacts radicalism, and then preserve legacy slavery is a situation where the landowners got behind it. I assume that if the landowners have their power base in a certain location, that these states are more likely to revolt. And in the United States, of course, the landowners in particular are insanely powerful in the South. I mean, that is quite literally the basis of the southern landowners right there. So this will basically guarantee that when preserved legacy slavery pops off into rebellion, it will pop off with a very much regional orientation right there. The most straightforward way to end the debate over slavery may be just to end it, so slavery, but this carries enormous risks. Political movements may emerge in reaction to the potential passage of these laws. Of course, not banning slavery may also lead to a movement emerging explicitly agitating for the abolition of slavery, and that has its own set of challenges. You could, technically, if that movement radicalizes, if the movement to ban slavery, let's say the intelligentsia, the industrialists, maybe trade unions, who knows, right? The religious faction as well is very involved. I was taught this by the very first, I think, dev diary that showed off some characters. Some people were telling me, yeah, the Quakers, for example, also the churches in general in the United States of America were very much against slavery. So these could be driving factors for a northern rebellion. But in that case, I wonder, I assume a northern rebellion wouldn't want to secede. They would like to push it through, right? So that would be just a normal rebellion anyway. Triggering the Civil War early caused a slightly different set of states to secede. Florida simply didn't have enough pro-slavery supporters here to join the pre-war movement that formed the basis of the CSA. Look at that, here we have it. The Confederate States of America have spawned. I think this is North Carolina, right? This is South Carolina. This is like Georgia. Somewhere's Louisiana. This is Louisiana. I think Mississippi, right? I know the states. Tennessee somewhere. No, this is Tennessee, I think. Either way, look at this. So this is dynamic. It makes sense. Just think about the revolutionary system or how the revolution system works in Victoria 3. And this is it. Except in the United States of America, it is more likely that this happens. And we're going to get to this right now. There is a very, very important difference here that I wish applied to all rebellions to a limited degree. This is where we have decided to engage with our own revolution mechanics in order to create a more dynamic American Civil War. If the slavery debate journal entry is active when a revolution over slavery erupts, the revolutionary government will turn into a secessionist government. But now I'm looking at this actually, so this means that the northern states that want no slavery would also try to secede. Secession is determined by what states join the radicalized movements for preserving slavery or banning slavery, which means the strength of the secessionist government will vary depending on which IGs align themselves with the radicalized movement prior to the outbreak of revolution. If pro-slavery interest groups had been empowered again and again prior to their radicalization and revolution, then secessionists will control a large number of states, but if those same interest groups had been suppressed and their influence limited time and time again, then their government will be far smaller when war breaks out. The better you manage it in the favor of the side that you want to win, be that the slavery side or be that the abolitionist side, the better they will fare. This is a good and important principle. They are clearly railroading here, railroading you here in most cases to have the Civil War, but you can still influence your starting position. And I think this is very important because otherwise, it depends on how it comes out, but in Victoria 2 it was very easy to win the Civil War, it wasn't even a question. I hope that the Civil War here, unless you really play it well, maybe even get a bit lucky, that the civil war here will be fairly hard to A, avoid, and B, to just have a very easy war. Having a civil war that lasts just 6 months or so wouldn't be satisfying. This is a much bloodier and much more important affair, especially with these special mechanics that follow the civil war in the United States when it comes to Reconstruction and so on, that other civil wars don't have. So with that in mind, I really do hope, because this is a delicate issue, that they find fairly good balancing here. I also want to point out, and this is what I meant, when I have a revolution, I would like it that if I, as the player, take over the revolutionary side, and only if I take over the revolutionary side, that I get the choice to make any given revolution into a secessionist movement. It's kind of odd. When would you choose this? Ultimately, you always want to have a big united state, but it's not really true, right? To a degree, it could be kind of nice to say, you know what, I want to roleplay, for example, rebellion in Russia, and the rebels are primarily, I don't know, for example, in the Caucasus, or for example in Siberia, and I just want to have an independent Siberia, but with a struggle. You could always say, of course, yes, you can just release that nation, that makes it easier, but that's kind of boring. I want the background, I want the impact of the civil war to actually have something going on there. It's a drama, it's a story, it changes the pops, it changes the setup of the world. And that's really what matters. It's always kind of gamey to just say, hello, I am the Tsar of Russia, also I hereby release Siberia, right? I would like to potentially use this in a roleplay way where they just permit me to choose, do I want to secede or not if I take over this side? I don't think the AI should ever do it. We talked about this in the Discord at length, and we couldn't really think of another example except the CSA. And the CSA, I mean, it was more reality there, right? We couldn't really think of a different example here, except maybe the Central American states, right? But in general, when you have a revolution of the primary culture, of the primary citizens that are acknowledged by this country, they didn't want to secede in this era, they wanted to take over, whereas, for example, the Hungarians, the Croatians, and so on may want to rebel, so, and actually secede. But I still would like the options. I simply would enjoy it, because it would make for interesting gameplay beyond just min-maxing, right? So that is just what I wanted to bring up there. I think that would be quite interesting if you gave this option to choose, hey, you know what, instead we will always be a revolution that then fully takes over. What if we just have a split? What if we have a partition? You know, where instead of always needing to annex or be annexed, you might just actually call it quits. You might just call it quits, and there you go. But the fact alone that they have the option here to overwrite the normal mechanic for revolution is really good for mods, because if you think, for example, let's say for whatever reason, right, you have a situation where Korea, you know, is split, that sort of stuff, and obviously they are the same country, or the same. It should be a country similar to East Germany and West Germany, of course, and you have a mod that simulates the Cold War. I think it could be nice if sometimes you could have situations like this. Think of South Sudan, for example. They seceded as well, and of course there are differences in culture and whatnot, but it was a country that seceded from itself, fundamentally, right? I would really enjoy if we could actually do that, if, you know, we could see something like this where you get to choose. But that is just something maybe I think that mods can already do. It's just in vanilla you don't get to choose. Mods can just override it anyway, right? Either way, let's take a look here at the train-centered event. First of all, nice train, of course. Enemy raiders have successfully stolen a locomotive and wrecked miles of track and telegraph lines in Ohio before being stopped. The wisps of smoke grew more and more feeble with each half of their tired locomotive, the general thought. Is the locomotive named the General? The raiders had run out of fuels miles back, and the rails they had torn up hadn't been enough to save them. In the distance, plumes of smoke from their pursuers grew ever closer. The chase was coming to an end. Damn everything else, rebuild those tracks and lines now, or troops on our trains will slow them down but make them safer. Right, so you get to choose it. This is a random event, I guess. I have to see these random events in action. I have to tell you right now, I'm not against this at all. This is a staple of many Paradox games, but random events oftentimes feel unsatisfying because you will see them so often, right? I much prefer the decision-guided thing, for example, what we saw in Crusader Kings 3's upcoming update when it comes to the struggle mechanic. I enjoy that much more than repetitive events when they just give you different tool sets, like in the struggle mechanic. Maybe these events are good, maybe they are bad. Honestly, I can't give you a judgment here because it's an event. Let's see how flavorful and how repetitive it will be in action. The war itself has its own incidents that can complicate the pursuit of victory or give some unique opportunities. Raiders will jump back and forth across the border, causing chaos. See, if I had the influence to give money to the raiders to make this work, to okay military operations that work as raiding, right? I would say that's cool, but if it's just random, I mean, you never know. Anyway, causing chaos while Unionist sympathizers in secessionist-held areas and secessionist sympathizers in Union-held areas will challenge the authority of local governments as long as the war is still burns. If the secessionists are pro-slavery, but the Union has not finished enacting abolition yet, the country will have a special change to radically hasten the change in law through a certain proclamation. I like it. The Emancipation Proclamation makes a lot of sense. Once you initiate the process, of course, if you then keep slavery active and just abandon the process, then what is the Civil War for? The war itself plays out the same way that wars do. If the secessionists win, then the secessionists win, and a new country is established in North America, a Union victory. A Union victory, however, will lead to Reconstruction. Reconstruction varies depending on how the Civil War went. This is something I actually love. I really like these dynamic options that you can get. Let's take a look at this. Reconstructing the Nation, event in District of Columbia. While the military fight has finished, the fight for the nation's soul has not. The United States of America must rebuild itself after being split in two. I do not expect this nation to fall. Welcome or unwelcome, whether it becomes all one thing or all the other, this nation shall cease to be divided in body and soul. A house divided against itself cannot stand. For the Union indeed. So this is the beginning of the Reconstruction, and I again like this a lot in the initial paragraphs as well. This, after winning the Civil War, is not an easy time. There was a lot of failure in this period, a lot of loopholes that were exploited to still discriminate, to still lead to a situation where there was no genuine equality. And this is very, very interesting because Victoria 2 didn't really handle this well. Victoria 3 must handle it well because you end up with a wildly different population after the Civil War. All of a sudden, the landowners are rid of their power because you just defeated them, and if they actually use the full... If they use the full revolution mechanic, then wouldn't that mean that the landowners in general, even after the Civil War, even if they keep their plantations, would be weakened as an interest group? Would be marginalized, right? So even then, you still need to get active so that the South doesn't get further radicalized or doesn't move into further discrimination. That is, of course, very important if you were to go into this direction. Reconstruction is a long and varied process. Depending on who fought, what laws were passed, and the general shape of the United States at war's end, different journal entries will spawn. Big fan. Dynamic content like that is absolutely vital because otherwise you will have stuff that just doesn't fit, and in this case makes it so that you actually have to deal with the aftermath of the revolution. I wish, honestly, and it wouldn't feel as satisfying as this, no doubt about it, but I do wish that maybe every revolution was accompanied by a post-revolution diary, you know, by a journal entry that then says, hey, how do we deal with the dissidents? How do we deal with the people that went against us here and took up arms? The fact that they approached this in the United States, I really like it. I hope that I would hope that they would do it elsewhere as well. Establishing the Freedmen's Bureau and pursuing the cause of equality only makes sense if you fought against slavery. Reconciling the South only makes sense if the South was part of the country that rebelled. Conversely, it's possible to end up with multiple goals of reconstruction that end up conflicting. Makes sense, you can't do everything, and sometimes you might not want to do everything, but you want to focus on certain things like rebuilding the South, but maybe, you know, you didn't actually want full equality. You simply wanted to end discrimination, and then you can just ignore some of the events, of course, that are going on there. Paramilitary intimidation. This was, of course, the time of very cruel and very brutal KKK campaigns as well. Political groups opposed to Reconstruction have organized militant units to intimidate voters in Mississippi and restore themselves to power. While I understand that our organization causes consternation among some elements of the population, I can assure you that our bayonets and our rifles are purely for display purposes only. Surely they are. A loyal state government is all that matters, or horrendous. Disband these units at once. This, hopefully, will depend on whether you have the resources, whether you can afford saying, we will act against you. This might cause unrest, this might cause yet another civil war, even though it might be smaller. It really depends on how you manage a nation. The United States, I'm just gonna say it, okay? No matter, I think, what you do elsewhere, I do think the United States will make for the most interesting national gardening campaign. Because this content is huge. This content gives you so much to do. We're talking about 1836 with the build-up, and then all the way to the 1860s, maybe to the 1870s, and then you have Reconstruction, and the game still actively participates in forming your country in a very historically important way, right? I gotta tell you, I think the United States just has a bit of an edge there when it comes to the content, of course, that they are receiving, because this is such a vital thing, and it is prime national gardening material right here. Reconstruction will be ugly. Historically, it wasn't a clean and smooth process, and in the game, it's not a clean and smooth process either. There was a struggle to balance the ambitions of Reconstruction against the resistance of a reactionary coalition that sought to restore their antebellum political power and impose a vision of racial supremacy upon society. Pursuing egalitarian measures will alienate these people and related groups, which may make governance more difficult and more expensive, because there's tax waste and such, right? While currying favor with them will undercut the foundations of Reconstruction and create another alienated population that will have to be contended with for the rest of the game. Again, that's exactly what I'm saying. This is so rich in content, especially, you know, at the end of the day, as long as the economic system is rich in interaction, the national gardening system will be there as well. But the uniqueness of this content will definitely make runs with the United States, I think, very, very special in comparison to, you know, your run as France, for example. Every step is fraught with challenges to the government and to the welfare of the people. Reconstruction will be rough. Big fan. Frontier justice is a tricky thing. Right. Lawmen in American Colorado have engaged in a shootout with several cowboys. The following investigation has revealed that the gunfight was likely due to a personal feud between American marshals and the citizens involved, rather than a pursuit of the law. People are demanding justice against the lawmen. Come on, does anyone else want to try their luck? See this badge? It means I'm in charge here. I'm justice. Now get moving. There's nothing to say here. He is justice. The lawmen are the law, and we cannot stop the law or recall the marshals. Very, very interesting. I do wonder, honestly, I hope that the event variety here is large. That is my main concern when I see this. I really like the system as it is described. I wish that there was an expansion that when you revolt, you know, yourself in a different country, that you can pick between secession and revolution. But primarily, honestly, I'm mostly concerned about the variety of events. I assume that there are enough, but that is something that must be tested and tried, because this clearly is quite heavy on the event flavor, especially compared to other more generalistic systems. Not all post-war turmoil will be right when the fighting happened. Knock-on effects of the Civil War will be felt across the nation, from the very center of government to the furthest tendrils of the frontier. It's up to you, the player, to decide how the country will face all these myriad challenges. What kind of America do you want to create? I like it. I like the general system. I wish the Revolution Secession thing was addressed, but the rest, I really enjoy the railroading aspect, but with the freedom, with the liberty of the player saying, I will strengthen, I will weaken in a very dedicated way, you know, in a journal system, in an organized way, or I might even be able to stop the Civil War if I take the movement that would like to rebel and weaken them enough, if I satisfy them enough by increasing the standard of living, for example, if I go on, for example, to remove the southern landowners from slavery as is, if I maybe industrialize the South, maybe make it so that they are in a different condition, they might not even oppose getting rid of slavery anymore if, you know, their material conditions are changed to a significant degree. Very interesting dev diary, but the next one will also be very interesting. Next time we're going to talk about how you can fight battles both in the American Civil War and with wars in general, with the one and only Kaiser Johann. Very, very interesting. Let me know what you think about where we are with Victoria 3. And let me know what you thought about this dev diary, of course. Let's see what the battle actually, you know, how it works, how it interacts. I think the next dev diary next week will be a long conversation, primarily because we are in a situation where all the way back when we started to talk about war, I said there are some background elements, like, for example, an officer corps, an officer tradition, right? An army headquarter organization that makes it harder or makes it easier to choose different strategies that would be more efficient or less efficient. And that is a topic that I would find interesting, and maybe that could play a role in battles, but I doubt it. That is something that they never brought up, that was never said, but I want to reiterate on it, because I think this, when we talked about the dev diaries back in the day, was something that we discussed. So let's take a look at that in the next week. For the moment, I will leave you here, and I'll see you then. Later, alligator.